It's my pleasure to welcome you here to the third of our seminars in our summer series. My name's Leonard DiLorenzo. I work here in the McGrath Institute for Church Life. If this is your first time joining us for one of our seminars this summer, we're very happy that you're here. If you'd like to catch up on what we did previously, we've posted videos of our previous two seminars on our series webpage, which is mcgrath.nd.edu/summer series. We'll put that link in the chat off to the side. My job today is really to introduce just our session and our host, our first speaker for this seminar. The roadmap for our session will be, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Brett Robinson, who's going to lead this session. He'll eventually introduce his colleague, our colleague, Caroline, who will be also presenting in this session. We'll do a round of question and answer after they share a little bit with us. And then they'll introduce two of our partners who will share a bit more with us. And we'll try and take a question or two after those two additional contributions. I'll hand this off now to my colleague, Dr. Brett Robinson, who's our Director of Communications and of Catholic Media Studies here in the McGrath Institute for Church Life. And Brett will lead our seminar for today. Take it away, Brett.
Thank you, Lenny, and welcome everyone to this session. And since this is called and Co-Responsible, first a call. Today's seminar is really designed to start a much wider conversation. So it's one that's already happening in small pockets around the church, but we think it needs a rallying point. And thanks to a generous Lilly grant, we'll be hosting a small cohort of parish and diocesan leaders here at Notre Dame in 2021 to ask this question: how can Catholic clergy and lay people engage new technology in ways that strengthen parish and family life? So as we move through the discussion today, if you find that this topic speaks to you and your vocation, please reach out to us. We've included an application link on the handout, and it will also be posted in the chat. So this is open to anyone working in or for the church. You don't need to be a communication professional, just deeply interested in today's topic. So if you have any questions about the program or the application, please contact me directly, brobins6@nd.edu. That'll be in the chat as well. And we hope you'll consider applying and joining us. All right. So why communications and co-responsibility? We have so many important topics in this series, from ecclesiology to liturgy to the priesthood. So why communications? Why now? Well, if you haven't noticed, our communications environment has changed dramatically, and it was changing even before the pandemic. The digital revolution was rapidly changing culture. So we need some firm ground to stand on as a church to assess this and to engage in it. And that ground is our faith. So communications understood theologically. So let's take a stab at that. In the church's view, communication is the giving of the self in love. So that comes from Communio et Progressio, a church document, the giving of the self in love. So consider the many instances in Scripture where this kind of communication is evident. God spoke all of creation into existence. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So God works with the media of time and space, and they are properly ordered. They are good because he made them. Or the Gospel of John: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Christ, the Word made flesh, is the giving of the self in love, in a visible form that embodies the highest form of communications. Christ is both medium and message. So the means by which God speaks to us is also the message he gives to us, that God so loved the world, he sent his only Son. A final example, this past Sunday was Trinity Sunday. So we could look at the Trinity, the perfect communication of self between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Made in God's image and likeness, we are called to communicate what and who dwells within us by our words and deeds. And this process of speaking, of uttering, is essential to our identity as human beings. Is our attempt to externalize thought and idea and emotion. Those are all gifts of the self. So with God's help, we give ourselves in love through communication. The church is a communication environment. It's rooted in the sacraments and a proper ordering of time and space. The giving of the self in love is most evident in the Eucharist. So again, from Communio et Progressio, Christ gave us the most perfect and most intimate form of communion between God and man possible in this life. and out of this, the deepest possible unity between men. So in the Eucharist, we see the medium and the message as one. The internet, for example, is a medium, and the things we post on it are messages. But which one, the medium or the message, has transformed culture more dramatically? The messages on the screen or the presence of the tool itself? We tend to pay a lot of attention to the messages, but it's the medium that's changing things. The medium as the message means the medium has a more profound effect on us than the message is being sent. Its very presence changes the scale and pace and pattern of human affairs. We could say the same thing of Christ. It was his presence in the flesh that had the deepest, most lasting effect on us. If we only considered what he said, his preaching, his parables, we would be missing a larger point. That is, the medium, the word, had to become flesh to embody the message. And the message is that God so loved the world, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. So we think this concept is essential for starting to imagine what a Catholic approach to co-responsible communication looks like. So what does a co-responsible communication ethic look like for the Church? The word responsibility comes from the Latin respondere, to respond. So co-responsibility is a co-response, clergy and laity responding to God's call together. And communication is a topic that lends itself naturally to co-responsibility in the Church, because as baptized members of the Church, we're all called to evangelize and communicate God's love to the world. So communicating that message of God's love is not the purview of just the clergy or a select few, but all baptized Catholics. Communicating the Church's message, the most important message there is, comes with three very important responsibilities. Responsibility number one, understanding our faith. Who is responsible for passing on this faith and understanding? All of us, parents, teachers, priests, lay ministers, all the baptized believers. So when it comes to media, this is what we tend to think of first. How can we use our media tools and technologies to inspire and evangelize others? This is a good thing, but it's not the whole story. There are other, even more fundamental responsibilities we have to attend to first. One of those is responsibility number two, understanding ourselves. Who am I? What are others expecting of me? What is God expecting of me? Responding to these questions is our first responsibility. Before we can become co-responsible, we have a responsibility to cultivate our interior life. And that interior life requires some silence. Every second, there are 6,000 new tweets posted to Twitter. Every second, there are 84,000 videos viewed on YouTube. We live in an empire of noise and mental pollution. And not just mental pollution, but environmental pollution as well. This year alone, internet usage will account for 1 billion tons of carbon emissions. So if we're going to be co-responsible in this media environment, the Church has more work to do than just posting to Twitter and YouTube. We need to start thinking ecologically, to ask, how is all of this connected? How do my media habits make room for relationship, encounter, and presence with others? How does media help or hinder my ability to cultivate the silence necessary to become intimate with God? What impact is my technology use having on the physical environment? Technology can distort our perception of what we're made for, as this little bird cartoon illustrates. Responsibility number three, understanding the environment. And this is where the exchange between the self and the other takes place. So we come to understand our faith and ourselves in the deepest way when we worship. Worship is a responsibility, a response to God's call. So when we worship together, we respond together. It's co-responsibility in its highest form. This is why we spend so much time and energy creating suitable environments for worship. It's why we talk about the music and the aesthetics, because a beautiful environment is more conducive to prayer and listening to God. Liturgy is that ideal communication environment because it leads to communion with God and one another. But how do we tend to other communication environments in a way that points back to the source of our being, the Eucharistic love of the Word made flesh? We'd like to suggest that environmental awareness is the most pressing task when it comes to a co-responsible approach to communication in the church. So what does that care for the media environment look like? Well, the church has taught quite a bit on media and communication. Communio et Progressio, Inter Mirifica, and several other important church documents focus on this. They tend to focus on content, so using media for transmitting the gospel message. And the church should take up these tools and use them to evangelize the globe. But there's another consideration. Very few people follow the church online, even among Catholics. So on Facebook and Twitter, less than 5% of Catholics follow diocesan and bishop social media accounts. And according to the Pew Research Foundation, less than 20% of Catholics consume Catholic content, any kind of content, or share their faith online. So while one of our priorities should be growing this audience, that's a content question. The better question might be about the effects of the context or the environment in which we're situated. That's why I think Laudato Si is such an important document and so timely and actually speaks directly to this concern. So in it, Pope Francis says, efforts need to be made to help these media become sources of new cultural progress for humanity and not a threat to our deepest riches. True wisdom, as the fruit of self-examination, dialogue, and generous encounter between persons, is not acquired by a mere accumulation of data, which eventually leads to overload and confusion, a sort of mental pollution. Real relationships with others, with all the challenges they entail, now tend to be replaced by a type of internet communication, which enables us to choose or eliminate relationships at whim, thus giving rise to a new type of contrived emotion, which has more to do with devices and displays than with other people and with nature. So an environmental approach to media technology gives us a look at the change in behaviors and structures of thought that occur. In the rapid development, John Paul II said, the culture itself, prescinding from its content, so forget about the content for a moment, the culture itself arises from the very existence of new ways to communicate with unknown techniques and vocabulary. So our environment is changing in some pretty radical ways. Digital culture has introduced a new way of being in relationship with one another. Politics has changed, the economy is changing, our family lives and rhythms and relationships have changed. But the church has been here before. So when the printing press was introduced in the 15th century, the political, economic, and religious landscape of Western Europe changed dramatically. Mass literacy meant a mass audience, and it also meant greater access to information that had formerly been the domain of the priestly class. Scripture, in the hands of everyone, meant more people could come to know God's word in a more intimate way. But it also meant that private interpretation sowed the seeds for the Protestant Reformation. So let's ask ourselves, are we on the brink of another religious reformation? Or is there the possibility of a renaissance? Our extra liturgical spaces outside the church, the home, the classroom, the office, the coffee shop, they are spaces also for communication and community and communion. But when those environments are disordered or out of balance, we feel it in our psyche. So consider the typical American classroom. There's a real push for incorporating more technical tools into learning. We hear from Catholic school principals all the time who have an opportunity to add iPads or laptops in classrooms, but are kind of on the fence about it. They realize it has some advantages, but also some disadvantages. So let's look at this environment. What does personal interaction look like here? Can these students even hear the teacher? How are they forming relationships with their classmates? Are they truly present to one another? And what does success look like in this environment? Higher test scores? Increased technological aptitude? Is this what school is really for? Now consider an alternative model, the Waldorf classroom, very similar to a Montessori classroom. No screens in sight, children are engaged in some kind of play and conversation, which is the best way to learn. The schools spend time teaching children how to knit, how to make things out of wood, and the classroom is filled with natural objects, no plastic toys or flickering screens. Everything is relational, person to person and person to nature. Incidentally, many tech executives, the architects of the digital environment, send their kids to Waldorf schools. They know how the sausage is made and they don't want their kids exposed to it. It's actually pretty ironic. So the educational environment is just one example. How do we cultivate our homes, our parishes, our liturgical spaces so that they increase our capacity to hear God's call, given these current conditions? If screens and noise fill our daily lives, do we really want screens in the sanctuary? That's an environmental question that requires some kind of environmental awareness. What's going on around us? We think that clergy and laity working together to assess this environment together in a co-responsible manner is the most promising way forward. And we think that the environmental analogy is the most useful here for co-responsibility because it's a common task. This integral ecology that the Pope talks about in Laudato Si is a very Catholic and analogical way of thinking. And the social and psychological balance that's necessary for building strong communities comes from understanding these media effects and how they affect community life. So let's look at that word medium for just a second. What's the etymology here? So in the Latin, it means middle. It also means an intervening substance through which a force or quality is conveyed. And it also means an environment. We said earlier that Christ is a medium. The medium is the message. And Communio et Progressio calls Christ the perfect communicator, but we could also say that Christ is the perfect medium. Why? Because he intervenes in history. He is the mediator between God and man, and he gives us a new environment. We can see this visually in the Last Supper. So in your notes, I'm skipping down to number 6 if you're following the handout. Notice how critical the environment is in this image and at this event. It's the upper room on the eve of the Passover, just outside the walls of Jerusalem, that all of this takes place. Now, theologically speaking, none of these details are incidental. Rather, they are key to understanding what Jesus is up to at this moment of profound communication and communion. Christ, the new medium, creates a new environment. The old covenant is being fulfilled. The old Jerusalem is passing away. The institution of the Eucharist and the priesthood means that Christ's church and the entire culture has entered a new phase. Christ is the ultimate new medium. Now, some of you may have seen this image circulating the internet over the past several weeks as we've all been locked down due to the pandemic. And I think it's actually, aside from being a little humorous, instructive, right? What happens to the medium, Christ, in this image? He's no longer in the middle, as the Latin medium refers. The technology now intervenes in our relationships. And this digital environment creates new social conditions of separation. So returning to number 5 in your outline, I want to conclude my portion here just by going through some of the features of this digital environment that are changing our perception and thereby increasing or perhaps decreasing our capacity to respond to God's call. One is the sense of time. So I'm sure you've all experienced this as I have, especially again, as we've been more and more immersed in a digital environment for more of our days, is that we lose track of time. We don't know what day it is. We don't know what time it is. And this was even true, I think, before the pandemic. The digital environment changed our sense of time. It seems to be going faster in a way. Our sense of place, right? I'm in my office here, but I'm also with you. And place doesn't seem to matter as much anymore in a virtual environment. And that's a problem. Slow reflection versus instant reaction. And we see this online all the time. When you think about print as a medium, when you read something, the structure and the form of print was conducive to reflection. It slowed you down. You had to contemplate. And now the dynamic of digital is instantaneous. Information abundance versus information scarcity. So now that we have more information, it actually means that the truth becomes more elusive. So much information means people can find their own truth in this sea of information. Some of it fake, right? A new tribalism has emerged. So factions and divisions, even within the church, are being amplified by social media and leading to a new tribalism. Producers versus consumers. In the television and electric world, we knew who the producers were, the movie producers, the television producers. We were the passive consumers. Now that line has been blurred. We're all producers now. And as a result, we all have increased responsibility for promoting healthy communication in this environment. And finally, there have been neurobiological changes. So our relationships with others have thinned out as they're increasingly mediated by social media, text, and email. We're less present to one another, psychologically, emotionally, socially. It also changes our thought process. Print, again, was very logical, linear. Digital is less linear, less contemplative, less concerned with depth. Our minds get stuck in what Nicholas Carr called the shadows in his book about what the internet, I'm sorry, the shallows, not the shadows or the shadows, but the shallows in his book about what the internet is doing to our brains. So this is a real challenge to the church because the church is a space of relationship and presence and depth. So we think this environmental approach can address these new challenges. To use media well together, clergy and laity need a common approach, and we think that the environmental metaphor is the most helpful because it includes everyone and encourages a co-responsible approach to all these mediums that make up our environment. So one of those environments I mentioned was the home. So I want to pass this off now to my colleague, Caroline Murphy, who is the program director of the Lilly program in church communications ecology. Her background is in psychology and theology, and she's also a mother. So she's going to speak to a little bit of these neurobiological effects and the effect of the environment in the home on our ability to be co-responsible in communication in the church. Caroline?
Thanks, Brett. I just want to first of all encourage everyone to please share any questions that you might have in the chat. That's open throughout this conversation, so please let us know what you think or if you have any questions. Okay, so as Brett laid out, the heart of our faith is relationship, but this is a special kind of relationship, specifically a familial one. Communication and evangelization are always inherently personal. But given the environmental shifts in our culture, even those in the church are now tempted to think of this evangelization broadly and abstractly. And our domestic churches simultaneously become ever more fragmented by digitalization. Many feel this instinctively, as though we're losing what it means to be human. So by grounding this conversation in our human roots, in our beginning in the family, I hope to emphasize the importance of thinking and framing communication in terms of face-to-face relationship, as Jesus modeled for us. Mother Teresa put it really simply, love begins at home. Technology can be a help and a tool only insofar as it points us toward this ultimately personal face-to-face, flesh-to-flesh communication. Whenever it threatens that, it must be actively pruned away. We're body and soul together, and so what happens to us on a psychological and neurobiological level has spiritual ramifications. John Paul II saw how critical it was that the foundations of all of our efforts as a church be rooted in the culture of the family. He says evangelization in great part depends on the church of the home. He says the family has a special mission, a mission which must be explicitly supported by the whole church. This is co-responsibility. The mission of the family, he says, is to guard, communicate, and reveal love. Guard, communicate, and reveal love. So like good stewards, we're called to evaluate the tools before us and use them only insofar as they further that mission. At times, it seems the tools have begun to use us. By shifting the conversation away from the abstract and back to the face, we can better and more adeptly evaluate which communication tools are truly a help to us. It's in the context of the family that the child is formed and capacitated to hear the voice of God and to respond to him. Ideally, the supernatural is meant to take root through the child's first natural experiences of love. When the child first encounters the gospel proclaimed, it's meant to resonate, to mirror, really, the gospel already enfleshed in their daily life. Content then meets the context. In this, the seed meets rich soil. Of course, God can overcome any obstacle, and any lack that the child might experience at home is never an impediment to grace. Nothing is impossible for him. But just as we shouldn't pray that God will feed the hungry without our action, even though he can, as parents, we still have a responsibility to actively try to understand what our children most need and then work to give it to them. Clearly, this call of co-responsibility echoes through the layers of the church and finds particular resonance in the interplay of the capital C church with the domestic church. So let's talk about the domestic church, the home, the soil. Brett talked about communication as self-gift. The home is so critical because it is the space in which we first receive ourself. A true home, as God intended, is the protected sanctuary, the private and familiar space where we are known, loved, and understood. A space where we're seen and heard, where we can relax, where we're nourished, body and soul. A home is the space where we first receive ourselves through our parents and then unfold. So we as parents are responsible for the environment of our home in our very responsibility to God himself and to his church. We'll just be a clanging cymbal if we attempt engagement with the larger church while neglecting or minimizing the import of the little one. My friend and colleague, Luis Vera, had a really insightful take on the way that parents might think of their responsibility to shape their home and family. He said, think of it as small L liturgy. Catholics today care about the liturgy. We know environment matters. The beauty of the sanctuary, the music, the silence, the ritual, the reverence, all of it matters. These fleshy things speak and shape. The signs themselves communicate. So following Lumen Gentium, he asked, what if we actually thought of our daily life as small L liturgy, the way we think of the domestic church as small C church? We as the priesthood of the baptized are called to consecrate the world to God by offering our daily life. So what if we took the same degree of thoughtful care to arrange the environment of our home and our action that some of the faithful take in regard to thinking about the environment and action of capital liturgy? Well, this begs the question, what kinds of action, what kind of environment would be truly conducive to nurturing our children to be able to hear God's voice and to seek his face? Let's begin by looking at the self in self-gift. In order to give ourselves, we must first possess ourselves. Think about times you felt unable to communicate well. Usually there's internal confusion, stress, or overwhelm, and we have less of ourselves to give. So we endeavor to facilitate our children's growth in a loving and attuned way to give them themselves. Childhood development is, like communication, fully relational, and both have their roots and grounding in face. A child won't grow properly without a rich relational life, even if her physical needs are met. For little primates, emotional security and comfort, essentially relationship, is preferred even to food when the choice is forced. But this orientation toward relationship goes even deeper than this subconscious instinct. It goes all the way down to the cellular level. It's stamped on the tiniest building blocks of our humanity. We can see this in a really beautiful phenomenon in developmental psychology and in psychology at large called mirroring. I'd like to use it as a metaphor for the entire concept of communication in the church. Parents mirror, priests mirror, and the church, our mother, mirrors. Mirroring, strictly speaking, is the process by which the motor system with a neural matching mechanism links other generated facial gestures to self-generated ones. It's a mirror effect called action perception matching, basically imitation. In this process, special neurons called mirror neurons fire on two occasions, when the child sees another perform an action and when they themselves perform that same action. So in effect, in the living body of the child, we have these neurons firing not only for that child's action, but in the exact same way when he observes another's actions, just as if the child himself were acting. So the mother or father's actions actually become part of their child in the same way that that child's actions are present to him or herself. The baby literally experiences his parents in the first months of life as himself. They are one. Their faces let him know that he exists. Their faces are a map by which he comes into himself. Teresa of Avila had a really vivid mystical experience of this oneness. One day, a beautiful little boy appeared to her. "I am Teresa of Jesus," she said. "Who are you?" He replied, "I am Jesus of Teresa." We become ourselves in relationship. Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," but it's utterly wrong. I am loved into being, therefore I am. And through mirroring, the child literally experiences in his or her flesh this being loved into being. The context and the content, of course, for this neurobiological communication is the human face. Biblically and in literature, we see the face as a representation of the true self. It's primarily through the meeting of faces in gaze that this foundational experience of self-gift first takes place. The gaze is the medium and the message. Saint Therese of Lisieux described her experience of prayer simply as, "I look at him and he looks at me." This is a perfect illustration of the way that we receive ourselves. On a natural level, we receive ourselves through the gaze of the loving parent. And on a supernatural level, we receive ourselves through the gaze of the Lord, through the gaze of the Church, our mother. For little ones, face-to-face interactions make up almost all of their communication. We can call this true FaceTime. We were made for it, and we are made through it. Interruptions of this experience of FaceTime for an array of reasons lead to really poor outcomes, psychologically speaking. We can intuit this. We instinctively crave and long for home all of our lives. And when we meet the eyes of another who's truly present to us, we feel loved and free. When we are denied this, we feel starved. So it's absolutely clear that we need to be intentional then about setting up a space and cultivating a space where families can flourish and experience this humanity with one another. It's clear that we need to reframe our church communications through the essentially personal and to refuse to let it be swept up into the faceless and bureaucratic technoculture. In the very heart of the sanctuary where we're designed to receive ourselves through this FaceTime, we now have to contend with another kind of FaceTime. Of course, we feel fragmented and insecure in an environment where this gaze is largely directed at screens instead of into eyes, where the faces we're so thirsty for are now literally obscured by masks, where the back and forth conversational cadence of the day is interrupted over and over through devices. The modern home is under all sorts of assault, and our church, our mother, needs to protect the family in the home, the sanctuary of self-communication. Brett outlined so many of these ways, changes to time, place, pace. Our brains are being rewired, and our beings are responding to technologies in ways we can't yet fully appreciate. This is just the very tip of the iceberg. Without proper context, technology powerfully and quickly divorces us from reality and impedes, from the earliest stages of development and from the neurobiological level upward, our human capacity for relationship with others and ultimately God. So we need to consciously steward a well-curated and intentionally personal environment oriented toward the person. The fruit of doing so will feed the whole church. Intention and attention provide a wellspring, an initial remedy to the dilemma of the increasingly parched soil of the digital age. We first need to understand the problem, which we're beginning to do in this conversation. And then we begin to intentionally rearrange our environment. And that will be an ongoing conversation in the Church Communications Ecology program. Then we need to cultivate habits toward the good. Little things like before checking the phone or the computer, we can ask ourselves, is there a face that needs me more right now? Our biggest ally will be our capacity for attention. Attention's built up like a muscle and it becomes stronger through use. The church has always understood this. This is prayer, giving one's whole consciousness and entire being to God. Both the church and science show that we need to attend to this first circle of the family before attempting to evangelize on a greater scale. The personal, relational environment of the first circle then suffuses the atmosphere of the second and third. Priests can mirror their parishioners, setting the tone. They can be present, cultivate attention, offer the sacraments in the context of relationships. Global media can attend to the human and to the personal, to the story rather than to the artificial one-size-fits-all approach. As Brett said, we're only speaking the very first words of a much larger conversation. We can't yet delve into the specifics, but I hope that the images I gave stay with you and help frame the way we think about communication, the very heart of our faith. As C.S. Lewis said, how can they meet us face to face until we have faces?
Thank you so much, Caroline and Brett. Friends, we want to take a moment here to bring in a question. And so we asked, Terry P. had offered a question in our chat. So I'd like to ask Terry to offer her question to the group, and then Brett and Caroline have a chance to respond if they like.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can. Go ahead, Terry.
Hi, it's a beautiful afternoon here in St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada. My question related to this ideal of a common approach. I know that across our diocese, especially in this pandemic, the response through, I guess, communication and reaching out to parishioners by the different pastors has been very different. Some have been really on board, some have shied away from it. And again, I think partly due to the age of the pastors, I think that's one consideration. But how, do we come up with this, I guess, approach where we're working towards relationships that are deeper? Any suggestions on how maybe the first steps of that might look?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think this pandemic situation has highlighted the reasons we need to attend to this even more. But we actually, in the first session with Dr. DiLorenzo, there was a discussion about using the telephone to reach out to parishioners, actually creating kind of a phone tree network to connect with people personally in the midst of this, make sure they're okay, see if they need anything. And the New York Times actually ran an article about this, not the parish level, but about the new sort of importance of the telephone and hearing the human voice in a time when you're not seeing other people. So this is really at the heart of the ecological mindset, is that as this kind of culture and environment shifts, and we're living in even a different time now than we were 6 months ago, the church has to be agile and be able to adapt to that and sort of take stock and discern among all the tools available what the right next move is. So efficiency-wise, it would be easy to email everyone in the parish and sort of check in during a time like this. It'd be faster, but it doesn't attend to the human need of hearing someone else's voice on the other end to check and ask how you're doing. So something that simple. Our pastor called every family in the church. I don't know how feasible that is for larger churches. That's where I think that kind of co-responsibility of the laity being involved in that outreach is important. Someone else mentioned in the chat the importance of print, right? So we dismiss print as if it's the old media, and yet all the studies show, especially for local newspapers, that this is what holds communities together, because it gives you a common kind of point of reference, some common stories. And I didn't show these stats when I was showing the kind of dismal Twitter and Facebook stats for diocesan media, but 24% of people still read the newspaper. That's compared to less than 5% on social media. So we have to be able to kind of look at the signs of the times, as it were, and see which of these media are relevant at the moment. And that may change from month to month, from year to year. And so that's the kind of discussion we want to have. And this is a great way to kick it off. Thank you for the question. But there is no sort of single answer to that, right? It's all situational and contextual. And that's how we kind of, I think, get to discerning the right tools. So there are some other great comments here in the chat too. I don't want to take too much time myself. So take a look at those. And if there are any other insights on that question, I'd love to hear them.
I think, Brett, we're going to maybe move on to the panelists now, and we'll bring in some other questions in a second time for question and answer a little later on. Folks, if you have questions, please continue to share them in the chat. We'll get to hopefully at least some of them, and then we'll hope to respond to them in other ways later. So give it back to Brett.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Jennifer Antkowiak from the Diocese of Pittsburgh. And Jennifer is the Director of Communications there. She joined late last year. and has faced a number of really incredible challenges with parish restructurings and mergers, the pandemic, of course, the sex abuse crisis. So this was a real baptism by fire for a communications person. Jennifer spent over 23 years in broadcast news and brings that media expertise now to the diocese. Very faithful Catholic, a beautiful story. And we're so glad she could join us and share some of her experience. So we've talked about the context, we've talked about the environment. Let's talk a little bit about the content. What are Catholic media professionals doing to fill this space with fruitful stories and dialogue?
Thanks so much, Brett, and hi everybody from Pittsburgh. It's a beautiful sunny day here as well. And yep, that's a good way to say it, baptism by fire. So, you know, just a quick little snippet to give you some perspective of how I landed in the role. I felt as a Catholic woman, as a Catholic mother and wife, the pain that came with sexual abuse scandal and a grand jury report. And I found myself in our church on my knees in tears, praying. And as I was praying, I was asking God for how can I help? And I heard very clearly a voice say, bring them back, bring them back. And so, it rattled me and it made me pause and it made me think, what does this mean? And what has he been doing with me and with my life? And so the call portion of this framework for this discussion today, I think this speaks to that. You know, even in the midst of having what many had experienced as a very hardened heart after hearing that, people who have some conflict with our faith or what's going on within the church, are we still people where we have experienced communication that allows us to keep softened hearts and open hearts to be able to hear a call, to be able to hear God's voice, as Caroline talked about, and then are we able to take action of that, with that? So when we experience something like that, I think as a human being, we are crazy excited to be able to share that with others. And so that was the fuel that landed me into this role. And so I, as a Catholic, I trust that God is with me, that I trust and rely on the Holy Spirit to guide me in decisions and in the creative process about how to create this space. I also teach at St. Vincent College, and when I teach about communication and business communication from an organizational standpoint, and this fits in beautifully with this discussion too, I teach the students, before you ever even think about opening your mouth and communicating with somebody, you better really know who that person is. Who are those people? So when we're talking about really practical next steps about how do we have co-responsibility in communication at this time in our world with the pandemic, let's think about that. Who are we talking to? Who is our audience? And what is important to them? And what keeps them up at night? And what are they worried about? And what do they need? And what kind of problems do they deal with? When they wake up in the morning, what's their space like? What's in their brain? How do they move through their day? What do they need? And so many studies have shown that our faith, the Catholic Church, has answers to what people need, right? We know that a Gallup poll showed that the number one thing that people in this world crave and need is hope. They say they need hope. Well, Jesus is hope, right? We get so much hope from him. So I think the message is solid. I think the concern is, how do we cut through the clutter that Brett talked about to be able to deliver that message in a way that will resonate with people? And so it can be honestly as simple, I have found, as in creating the space, number one. In the history of the church, I think we are trained that communication is very one-way communication. So you think about people going to church, hearing the word of God and saying goodbye, maybe reading it in the bulletin or reading it in the church newspaper, and that's it. There weren't a whole lot of opportunities for two-way communication. Our world today requires that we engage people so that they hear the message. And I think one of the blessings it's strange to talk about it in this way, but one of the blessings of the pandemic is that it forced churches and dioceses to rise up, to embrace the new technology, and to be able to think about it in a way that allows them to be creative when they think about it as a friend instead of as an enemy. And believe me, I have a love-hate relationship with social media, big time. But you know, one of the things I love about it is it allows us to build relationships with people. It's not as impactful as the things that Caroline was talking about, where we need, as human beings, we need face-to-face. We need touch. We need to experience all of the senses to really wrap ourselves in a message and be able to absorb it. So the challenge is, how can we take the new reality and translate even a portion of that online? And so what we've found is, number one, we create the space, and we teach people that this is now going to be a space where there's two-way communication, meaning you're going to give comments, and we want to hear those comments. And we want to encourage you to share pictures of your family, pictures of, you know, maybe what you're doing at home to try to create a prayer space for yourself. And so we ask a lot of questions. We encourage a lot of response. We realize that when we analyze the audience and what they need, the idea of co-responsibility gets easier, honestly, because when you analyze that person, you understand that, yep, sometimes they need to hear from your bishop. And we've had many videos from Bishop David Zubik. We were able to have him, and he continues to celebrate masses with the faithful. And so, you know, usually it was a treat for him to be able to visit different parishes. And we were able to share that with people in a way that they understand. In the midst of the strain and the struggle of the pandemic, here's an opportunity to come together with the pastor of our diocese, our bishop, and celebrate Mass with him. And so, you know, we were able to have over 30,000 families join him for Easter Sunday liturgy, for example, from scratch, from pretty much zero on a YouTube channel. And so I'm not saying that to brag, I'm saying that to prove that there's a craving, there's a hunger for this kind of material and for this kind of connection. And both Brett and Caroline spoke so beautifully about the human need for family and for community. And so how can we translate that in these online spaces? And this is where we get into not just sharing messages from the ordained. We think about us as, you know, by baptism, we're all ordained to be able to share Christ's word and hands and feet of Jesus kind of work. And we recruit and we share other people's videos. So lay people's moms and dads and children. We let them share their videos so that people can see in action, you know, how God's word, how God's love is filling them up, and the things they're able to be doing as a result of that. So whether that's, you know, the child who is making masks for first responders who need them, or the teacher who's driving through neighborhoods, putting signs and balloons in yards of graduating seniors. We're able to show, you know, God's love through each other. And that has been something that has generated so much response in such a positive way. We also frame it, and Brett, I think that this speaks to, you know, the understandings that you said that we need to have. And we frame it as learn Jesus, love Jesus, live Jesus. That's actually part of a prayer that Bishop Zubik wrote for us as we go through this big reorganization on mission for the Church Alive here in Pittsburgh. And so we think about our messaging like that. You know, we as a communications team think, how can we help people to learn Jesus, to love Jesus, and to live Jesus? And there's so much collaboration and co-responsibility that happens naturally when, again, you think of it with your audience in mind and with helping them to open their hearts, keep their minds open to hearing God's word. I'm happy to help with any questions as we move along. But I hope there's a lot that's going on, and we do a lot, but I hope that, learn, love, live Jesus. That's right. But I hope that, that if you have any questions, I'm happy to help you.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was beautiful. I'm going to move on to our next panelist, and we'll have some time at the end here for some Q&A and discussion. So I'd like to introduce Míriam Díez and Jesús Colina, both representing Aleteia. So among the 20% or so of Catholics who do consume Catholic content online, it's likely they've seen something from Aleteia, who reaches 20 million readers worldwide. Jesús is the founder and president of Aleteia, and Míriam is the director of the Blanquerna Center for Media, Religion, and Culture in Barcelona, Spain, one of our partners in this Ecology project. So I'm pleased to introduce them and have them tell us a little bit about how they've seen co-responsibility play out in their ministry and their apostolate as media professionals in the church.
Yes, thank you very much, Brett. And good evening from Spain, the country of Santa Teresa. Aleteia, you know, Aleteia is a very interesting project because it involves all the community. And our model as a platform, as a Catholic platform, is the ecclesiology of communion. And we have the challenge to speak on behalf of the faith while not expliciting only religious issues. So this is this difficulty and this challenge. We presented our platform in the Vatican, and it was during an audience with Benedict XVI, with the Pope, in the framework of a conference on evangelization, new evangelizers for the new evangelization. And from the beginning, we have tried to be a laboratorium of this kind of ecclesiology of communion. We think that lay people should not be regarded as collaborators of the clergy, but rather as people who are really co-responsible for the church being and acting. And in this model, we have three bullet points. The first one is that the clergy, mainly bishops, priests, are not necessarily the CEOs of a media company. They are the inspirers, and they support this evangelization. And we help each other. This is a synergy, this is a reciprocal task in the church. Our investors are real entrepreneurs. They are convinced that they need to put their talents at the service of the new evangelization. They have a duty towards also the new generations. And journalists and communicators are not the bishops or the stakeholders, which serve the truth of the human being to make it shine. He must increase, I must decrease. We think that together we could be witnesses of God's love. We were listening now the importance of loving and loving Jesus, this love of God, to spread this love of God to all our brothers and sisters, to remember that in the word brother, we have the concept other. So we need to take this sharing, this communion, to hear different voices, to raise also the voice of the most vulnerable, and also trying also to find always inspiring stories, sharing witnesses, the same concept as the Pope shares for the message of the communications day. Inspire people, tell stories, do not be abstract, go concretely to the life, and change the world and the environment. So this is our idea, our ecclesiology of communion. And now Jesús Colina will tell you how we try to do that methodologically in our platform. Thank you.
Hello and welcome everybody to Rome. So how we evangelize through the media. Social media, the web, the smartphones are the new environment, the ecosystem of people's life. friendship, and even moral values are transmitted today through these new platforms, through smartphones. How we can evangelize in this new media and with this new media. Our message is timeless. Catholic life is the path of joy and happiness. Our communication model is Jesus Christ. Jesus told us stories, parables. These parables do not propose complicated theories, nor do they brainwash or push an ideological agenda. They just explain what true love is about. Such love inspires us to become the best version of ourselves. So, to be credible witnesses of Jesus Christ, we need to live his only and biggest commandment, to love God and to love each other, to show this love, to show the love to the enemy. How? With joy. We need to be joyful, hopeful, inspired. We need to be confident. We need, with peace, magnanimous. We need to be also smart, insightful, benevolent, gregarious, facilitating encounters. We need to be respectful, curious, open, not forcing ideas on others. And we need to be relevant, influential in culture, interesting, impactful. In synthesis, we present the beauty of our Catholic faith in our daily life through spirituality, lifestyle, news, and also, why not, entertainment. We received 20 million of users during March. This shows that people are looking for God. Discover aleteia.org, and thank you for this moment.
Thank you, Jesus. All right, welcome back, everyone. We just have a few more minutes, and I want to first thank everyone for attending. The conversation really was so rich in the breakout room, and I'm sorry we didn't have more time for that. But as Caroline said, and as I've been saying, this is the beginning of a conversation in the church about media, about how to use it well together, bringing those theological, anthropological insights to bear on how we engage with this environment in a prudent and virtuous way. So again, if you're interested in doing this with us, we want to hear from you, even if it's just an email chat. I'm going to be downloading our chat from today and trying to reach out to folks that had additional comments and questions. Again, email me as well. I'm on the McGrath website. My email's there. There's a lot of people at the Institute here thinking about these things because it does impact really everything from liturgy to devotion and so forth. And so I want to point you to, I'm just going to bring this slide up for you, next week, which is liturgical formation of the family for co-responsibility. So that's with Dr. Tim O'Malley, Dr. Karen Shadle, and Dr. Catherine Harmon. Promises to be a really stimulating session and one that really builds on some of the things we tried to talk about today, which is how good communication and co-responsible communication starts in the home and points back to the church. And so I want to thank all of you again for joining us today. Please feel free to reach out, and God bless you all. Thank you.